Okay, so I'm a newcomer to the area. And I would describe where I live as, and I'm an EOB, which is east of Barnes's Corner. So that's where we bought a farm at auction. And I never wanted to have a farm just south of Barnes's Corner because they're excellent. All right, so. All right, I'm going to use a few of the lines. You might hear some of the lines that you read in this book, Paul, but I don't figure there's much risk in you getting too much redundancy out of these lines because no one seems to be able to get all the way through my book anyway. So I'll just give them out. Agritopia was a 44 winter project for me. And it was, I wrote it because I saw this decline in the middle class farm. And it really, that full decline is absolutely a result of government policy. So the USDA is, and the subsidized farm system is what set this up. So I kind of go through that in depth, but I don't really want to make this a lot about policy, but if you guys want to delve in there at the end, we can. So, to begin with, I have to talk a little bit of the personal stuff. This was not an autobiography because I am not the guy worthy of an autobiography. So I had to throw these personal stories into this book to keep the thing going. And one of my farmer buddies said the other day to me, he's going to Washington, D.C. to take this hybrid farm savings account that was kind of the main solution to the problem was to do a savings account for the farm, kind of like the health savings account. Well, this buddy of mine said, you know, Dave, you really took on a really boring subject there with policy, foreign policy. But you sprinkled in enough stories to keep me going. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk a little bit more of our farm stories. So I was raised what my mom and dad called Amish Catholic. So I'm sorry, but I didn't know much about the RLDS religion or anything. I got the first day at the farm sale, I got a really good history lesson on RLDS. But so I had a lot of brothers and sisters. We ate a lot of green beans, and my mom and dad didn't care if the green beans were real big and tough, they'd still can them. And so we were raised a lot like the Amish and a little bit on the poor side, maybe, because dad taught school and had the part-time farm and gave me a little bit of a chance to learn cattle, even though I'm not a good cattleman compared to Valentine and Barnes's here and Kennedy's and Stevenson's. I'm not a good cattleman, but I appreciate cattle so much for the value that they have for the middle class farm, because basically they chickenized every other business we had in livestock. You know, definitely pork got chickenized, chicken got chickenized, turkeys. The only thing really that we got as a mainstream livestock that's kind of an independent source of revenue would be cattle, sheep, you know. So we got to this little crossroads in our life. I've been back and forth across the Midwest a number of times. So when I married Jill, my first wife, that I'm still married to for 30 years or two, it doesn't matter. But we started out and we were in Ohio. We met at Ohio State University, and we thought we need to get a real farm because I only had 83 acres there that was just bare dirt. And we wanted to find a farm that had a real set of buildings and a house where we could maybe start a family. So we started looking in Ohio, and it was so expensive. You know, a lot of 17, 18 over $2,000 at the time. That was in 88. So that was recovering out of a 1980s farm crisis. I never had to go through the 1980s farm crisis. I see faces out here that did. I'm the lucky age group that avoided 15 to 20% interest rates. So actually, I was the beneficiary of the 80s farm crisis. So, when I'm complaining about $2,000 ground, those guys had already been to 4,000 and wrecked that ground back down to $2,000 an acre. But I was still having trouble figuring out how we would do that. So we ended up, I had done an internship in college in Eastern Iowa. And I always like those big, beautiful churches, just gorgeous churches. And I said to my wife, I said, let's go out there and just look one time. Well, we found something for $1,700 an acre it was near this beautiful little Catholic church and farm community, which is on the back of the book, which the Catholic Church is unfortunately shutting down because there's an assault on rural churches up in there. But so we ended up buying this 186 acre farm there. So to move out there is my first story. That's a little fun. And that would be, if you wouldn't, there you go. So that's the farm we bought in Iowa. And that is actually the cover of the book. So Northeast Iowa, Dubuque County, a little town called Bankston. I didn't have any money. When I sold that farm, I rolled that farm into this one. So there was no cash came out of that deal. And I didn't have a good job either before that. And so I'm like, okay, how are we going to move? So I took my two old grain trucks and stuck them together. If you would, please, Steve, go to the next picture.
Oh, you bet.
So that is a picture of the two trucks that we drove out from Ohio to move all of our farm chattel to Dubuque County, Iowa. Now, my sister, she can be a little snobby, and she's very well educated. She's a Yale graduate and stuff, and she doesn't give me any compliments except one. She said that last Conestoga chapter in the book, she said she couldn't put it down. So that's the story of this move, and I can't do all of it justice, but Jill and I left Ohio with a lot of hope. She was riding shotgun in that Ford cab over. And we got halfway across Illinois. And that darn, we heard a munch, and it happened to be the front left wheel bearing. It munched. It was like right away we knew there was a problem. So we squeaked it out just a little bit, and then I don't know how it came about, but I don't know if I called him first or not, but we ended up with a buddy of mine in central Illinois at his farm. He has horses. He's really good horse. But this wheel bearing had to be fixed to get the rest of the way out to Iowa. We were only halfway there. We're 300 miles in. And by the way, you guys, I just put a bungee cord between the steering wheel and the door on that old binder, that International truck that's on the back side. So, and because I didn't know how exactly I was going to pull, I had a professional hitch made. It was really nice setup. And I had that little binder truck would follow me around the corners like a dog in heat. I mean, it was just beautiful. But that rig worked so good. And we had all the lights rigged up, everything. We just ran with flashers, 40 mile an hour. If we got to 50 mile an hour, it didn't feel so good about it. But 45 on 2-lane roads, no interstate. And you guys would be surprised between Ohio and Iowa how desolate the 2-lane roads are, especially 136, which I think almost goes through Nauvoo. But that Route 136 across Illinois, and there's a continuation of it all the way straight across Indiana and into Ohio. So it was a really good 2-lane road. So we get to, he and his fertilizer dealer crew of guys got me wham bammed and got that wheel bearing in. So we take off, and about the time we take off, we're looking out west to that western sky, and I go, man, Jim, what's coming in here? And he says, oh, there's ice and freezing rain and snow and everything. Oh, great. That front truck doesn't have much of a heater. I don't think when they designed that front truck that they even put any thought into a heater, because it was just all cold air. So we take off toward western Illinois, and darn if this storm's coming hard on us, and our lights aren't real capable. Something's going on. So I pull over. We stayed at a hotel there in western Illinois, and I started digging into that whole issue. And I decided, well, I better use the old binder to charge the battery on the blue truck, because for some reason we're not charging it anymore. We're 450 miles into this, and we're not charging. So the next morning, of course, there's snow on the ground and it's miserable. My hands are about frozen off, fixing batteries and looking at the alternator, checking current and everything. We get to the west end of that town that morning, and that daggone front truck catches on fire. And we're jumping out and things are falling out with us. I'm like, what the heck's just happened? And, you know, I get it onto a safe lot, and like, I didn't want to cry, but I still got to go probably a couple hundred miles. And like, this isn't going to work with this truck. So I did a little thinking. That old binder on the back's always run great. And I had all my farm chattel in there. So of course I had a spool wire and duct tape. I mean, as an electric wire. So I fired up the back truck and run down along the side. I ran that wire to the front truck, and I tied in, and I really don't remember whether it was tying in at the coil or at the voltage regulator, or at the distributor, or where I tied in. But I had that back truck running that front truck within an hour. And so it was because dingleberry me, the part of I missed in Boy Scouts was being prepared for anything. I kind of was, but I wasn't on the hitch. The hitch was not going to be able to reverse trucks. So I still had to have the blue truck up front, because that's the way we had built the hitch. So I get this thing all booted up and running, and we're heading down the road again. And it's going great. And that little binder in the back sitting there idling just ran like a clock all the time anyway. So, okay, so we are in Iowa. We crossed the bridge. Jill riding shotgun. And I said, you better watch out for the engines. They're out here in Sioux country. And I said, you keep that shotgun running. And that's what they did on those Conestoga drives. So we were having a little bit of fun. It was grooving right along, and then we're going northbound in Iowa, and this bull rack comes at us about 70 miles an hour. I'm going north, and you know, of course, behind that cold front was that north wind. Cold. I mean, our toes, our feet, everything was cold, just like those Conestoga people would have been. And we were sitting there going northbound, and that bull rack comes and he sucked the air right out of my air cleaner. I'm serious. I mean, I barely had time to get off that road and off to the side. And that's what happened. I mean, he pulled the air away from and we were pulling that hill, and it was taking a lot of air to get up that hill. Boom. I'm off to the side. I'm dead in the water. But the International's still running. But I didn't have enough air. I had electrical, but I didn't have air. So I get her all stopped, and we start going through a whole reboot process, and a grain bin is sitting there, you know, cold weather. What are farmers doing? They're cooling their grain down in the grain bin. And we unfortunately have to pull off next this monster grain bin with a world-class size fan right in her ear. and I got to reboot this whole system. And this has obviously delayed us from getting there by the third day. So we're starting to push it because we had a flight booked to get back to Ohio to get our cars. And so we're like, Jill's wanting me to push this thing into the dark. And I'm like, Jill, we got like half of a light system here. I'm not doing that. So we find a gas station and pulled off there for the night and dropped the big truck. We took the little binder on. Finally, on the end of that third night, we were at our new farm that we had bought from an old dairy farm, the one that's on the cover of the book. But story ain't quite over yet. All right. So we got to pull this daggone hill. It's deceiving how flat pictures will make that farm. But we have to go down. There was a guy that lived right at the end of that lane. It was a half-mile lane. So, and we had to go down to that bottom, and up where they perched the house was up on the flat rise. So I hadn't really figured, I didn't figure on snow to begin with, and I didn't really figure on how we were gonna get all of our chattel and all of our dishwashers and everything up to the top of that hill and get it unloaded before we had to get a plane. But I went down through the bottoms between the barns and I put the pedal to the metal. I mean, I really laid into her to get to the top of that hill. And we got up there and I was digging like a dog on a molehill. And darn if I didn't break traction. I got my front wheels up on the flat, but the back wheels lost traction. And Jill can't drive a manual worth of crap. So if I'd have had anyone that was capable that way, I would have had them in the back truck, and then we have four-wheel drive. But that wasn't even an option here. So we slid all the way back down that hill with two trucks, and I'm like, I can just see the local paper is going to say, Ohio couple proves they can hit the broadside of a barn. I jackknifed it, and I jackknifed it pretty hard because I did not want to hit one of those nice barns. And we bound up there in no cloud of dust though, because it was all snow covered. So it wasn't with, I don't know that it could have been 5 minutes. And here comes this Jeep down the driveway. And I met my neighbor at the end of the lane for the first time within 5 minutes of all that crap going on. So I took a deep breath and tried to act cool. And Dick and Carol pull up, which Dick ended up getting nicknamed the Dick at the end of the lane. But he was such a great neighbor. And that's the way they always were. They were always there. They weren't there to bother you. But then again, I did always feel like we lived in a fishbowl. Because Dick and Carol were nosy enough. But I learned a lot of good techniques from them, though, too. But they helped us. So within another 10 minutes, they had a 40-20 with chains on it. And he just pulled me right up to the top of that hill. And that became my life of being always, at the the neighbors were always there to help us. And in fact, they are in this neighborhood I live now too. They're just, but it's not that, I gotta say, it ain't the neighbor that's farming 20 or 30 or 40,000 acres that's there to help each other. The neighbors that are there to help you when you need it, or you're there to help them, are the neighbors that live in the community. And that's one of the problems with the way we've designed all that. And that's what I'm fighting for, is a redesign of the system that's hurting those kind of neighbors. Now, I thought about RLDS. I come into,
we went back to Ohio after 10 years or 7 years on this farm with the red barns. We went back to Ohio for some cancer things. And then 10 years there, we kind of chased what I thought was the future. I decided I didn't want to be in government programs anymore. I was about 800 acres of row crop thinking I have to figure out a way to be an independent farmer, independent of the subsidized system. So we had a couple things come together at that time. We started growing a cattle herd, but it was really nerve-wracking. We lived on a state route with these FedEx trucks just barreling down up and down that road in Ohio. I didn't really want to grow a cattle herd in Ohio. Then the school comes along and says, hey, you guys, your kids are going to have to urinate in a cup to go to public school. And I said, what? And it was a drug testing program. $17,000 the high school was going to pay to drug test all the kids in the school. So, of course, I go to a school board meeting for the first time, and these people sat on the stage like these stone-faced people from, what's that island, Easter Island. And I made my case in front of them. I said, we're broke already, and you guys know the problem kids in the school, 17,000. My kids will not use that cup. And so they kicked the kids out of everything, but even driving to school was considered an extracurricular activity. So all this stuff came together at the same time. I said to Jill, if we're going to farm the way we want to, we're going to have cattle. So and I knew Iowa pretty good. So where in Iowa would you look if you wanted a cow calf herd? Well, you'd look in southern Iowa. So that all came together, and then so we either answered. Harry, can you help me? The guy's name that had the farm for sale just west of you, along the main road. So either Fred Warner was a family farmer in that area of Terry Barnes's. So he either answered our thing in the paper from the Des Moines paper, or we answered his ad. But anyway, we ended up on Fred Warner's farm looking at it. And Fred was pretty proud, and Fred had a nice farm. And Jill, we get out of the vehicle, and Jill goes, we're screwed. I said, why? And he said, look at the trinkets. Fred was all John Deere. He had trinkets all the way down his sidewalk, all the way to the house, and a beautiful, immaculate place. And it was all John Deere. And I'm not sure I didn't have a red case sweatshirt on. So we're sitting there talking to Fred about the farm and knowing our goose is probably cooked because, there's quite the John Deere versus Case thing. So he asked me he asked me the qualifying question, did we farm with John Deere? And I had to tell him that I have a gas John Deere 4020 and I can't stand that tractor. Because it was a gas 4020. The diesel 4020s were just fine, but the gas John Deere 4020 was a POS. Anyway, so we did make an offer, but it wasn't the offer Fred wanted. So later in town, I'm talking to a realtor that had heard what I offered. And he says, you know what that was? That deal right there that you did with Fred Warner? He says, that's where two fools met. And I love those kind of offhanded compliments because apparently we had offered way too much and Fred had actually turned it down. But he might have done it all over John Deere versus Case. So we end up at an auction because we couldn't get Fred's place. We had noticed the Ellswick farm for sale, which was on the way. We wanted to check out this town called Lamona because we heard it had 8-man football. And obviously, if you're a genetic package like me, you're gonna have to maybe think 8-man or 6-man or 2-man. But anyway, we were heading toward Lamoni from Fred's. Little did we know we went through the Barnes's Corner, but we saw this farm for sale and we drove up in there. I mean, we must have just caught it almost the day the sale sign went up. And we drove up into Ellswick's and I go, it needed a little work. It wasn't real fancy. So it reminded me of my childhood. And I said, this is the kind of farm I could deal with. So I came back out for that auction. I mean, and I brought my dad, and my dad's not exactly into what I'm thinking of doing. But dad's never been one to really tell you what to do. He's into freedom. So dad went along with it, and he's out in the parking lot reading the book of Job because here his son's leaving some ground that I was farming some of his ground. And I go into this auction and I don't know nobody. And I sat up front so nobody could see me sweat, or maybe unless I was sweating down the back of my neck, which I probably was. And I kept bidding on that farm, and it got to a stalemate. There were no more bidders in that room. I was the last guy standing, and they stopped the sale. I think I own the farm. I think I get this farm. But they stopped the sale, and they had a little powwow up there, and they said, they announced that they had a phone call to make. So they called somebody, and then she jumps in and starts bidding. So she I think had been buying some farms for her dad, but she had forgotten to write the sale down, and she was doing this bidding from a government office. And my least favorite government office called the FSA office, Farm Service Agency. So we went up and started bidding again, and then finally the dust settled, and I'd gone to some small bids, and I ended up owning it. So at that farm sale, I was going out to check on my dad because this thing was going on forever, signing paperwork. And I said, hey guys, I'm not leaving you, but I got to check on dad and maybe bring him in. And on the way out, the Heidi's grabbed my arm. And the Heidi being next to Paul DeBar's farm, a 240 acre RLDS farm. So the Heidi said, while you're in the area, we'd like you to look at our farm. But my migraine headache didn't want me to look at anything. But I did. I said, yeah, let me get this all done, all the signatures, and we'll go with you guys to look at the Heidi farm. And I said to Dad on the way out there, I said, I'm not sure I got enough money because we didn't even sell anything in Ohio yet. Well, take that back. We were planning to sell only one little piece with the house on it in Ohio. So I didn't have a lot of money. So I had to depend on what Farm Credit would give. So I talked to them and talked to Farm Credit, and we started getting a deal going. And then I thought I lost the deal. And then I had given up on the deal with the Heidi farm. And at the after I had given up, they called me back and said, we'd like to sell it to you. And I still think part of the Heidi decision might have been that we were going to bring 5 kids into the Lamoni school district, and be a family that lived on the farm. And I think there's a lot of, man, I'd like to go back and see all those families on those farms again with kids and grandkids and everything, because that's what makes these communities tick. Without that, you don't have a thriving rural community anymore. So, but on the RLDS thing, it was curious that the Heidi's, I didn't know anything about that the Mormon religion had reformed and more enlightened religion. And so But my dad, he's a, okay, yeah, thank you. I won't say any more then. But I thought after a while, starting out around here, I thought the RLDS owned everything because they keep talking about RLDS farm. Paul's was referred to as an RLDS farm. Mine was. And if you got a minute, can you address how that came about, that these were RLDS farms? So Stevenson's farms between where I live, 5 minutes, thank you. That farm there was always called an RLDS farm too. So I thought they owned just about everything at one time. But so that 240 has been a godsend for us because of the cattle business, because of the cattle, because it had fences and interior fences, cross fences, some of which trained my cattle to jump really well though. But all right, well, I last thing I want to tell a story on would be mouse tube. I brought this up here not because it's illegal to have a good, but it's a thought. So everybody at the Seed Corn meetings loves to hear me tell the mouse teeth story. Because one day I was out doing manure spreading and pushing onto a spring planting. So it was like, that's my planter tractor that's on the manure spreader. So I got to get all this done. We got a rain coming. Farmers are always in a race against the weather. So I got to get all this manure spreading done. And it's getting into one of those cycles in the spring where it's heating up. So I've got, all I had with me in the tractor was just larger than that old tea bottle that had been reused as a water bottle. So I'm bouncing around on these hills, spreading manure. And along the way in that 3-day run, I bounced the lid off the bottle because it was rubbing up against my bouncy seat. And some night, some mouse must have decided, there's always mice coming out of those manure piles, and some mouse must have decided to take a drink. But the problem is, he didn't get back out. And the problem is also, I didn't see it. So I'm running on that last push, and I'm like, I know it's going to go into dark, but that's all I got. Jill was working, the kids are all in school and stuff. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to keep pushing into the dark here. And I saved that water, seriously was tasting so good right down toward the end. And I was saving that last bit of water in that bottle to get me to the finish line. So it was probably somewhere before dark. I took that last drink, and it tasted like old mushrooms. And not that I eat old mushrooms all the time, but I looked down that bottle, and there was Arnold Schwarzenegger mouse. Well, and what was left, it was all brown in the bottom. As I called my daughter, I said, I'm trying to figure, how do I do this? How do I treat this? Because really, hemorrhagic disease could kill you. And I didn't want any part of that, but I didn't want to stop. I didn't know what would be done to correct this. So I said, Eva, I have this really old bottle of whiskey. I don't like whiskey much, but I had this really old bottle of whiskey. And I said, Eva, which was one of my daughter's third kid. And Eva brings out, she comes walking across the field with a shot glass of water. And because she's trying to save me from eternal damnation, just like her mother. And she gets up to the tractor, and I said, oh, Eva, just go get me the whole bottle. I figured it was in the old pallet, and it wasn't. She said, I only brought you the shot. I said, well, then you're going to have to go back and get me the bottle. And I swear to God, I only put about from one side of the SKU label to the other of that bottle in me. And and I finished the job, the manure spreading job. But the tractor got taller and taller, and the songs on the radio were really becoming inspirational. And when I got home, I fell at the door into the pile of bikes that the kids left right near the front door. And so the next morning, I said to Jill, I did chores, came back. I said to Jill, you know, it's amazing. I feel this good. I didn't throw up or anything. She said, David, we parked a chair near the toilet and you threw up most of the night. And one of the kids said, yeah, Dad, if you were from Camelot, you'd be Sir Drunk a lot. And I said, guys, this is no way to be. And ends up, that's how I treated the hemorrhagic disease and everything. I mean, honest to God, it was an effective treatment because it got everything out of it. So in closing, I'd like you guys to know that if I'd have done the political economic speech, I want you to know that the reason you're paying more for beef right now is also a product of the farm policy that I'm fighting against. Because in 1997, when they came out with revenue crop insurance, that put corn and soybeans on a ton of acres that were formerly pastured. Okay, when all the CRP came out, the CRP came out and replaced a lot of our pasture ground. So what we created is a pasture shortage in the US with all these other policies. And so we have to get away from the subsidized system, let it get back to a more natural. And hopefully we can develop the savings account idea where it mimics like healthcare has that health savings account. And I believe that would be a future in agriculture that would bring, everybody would have that savings account. If you grew 20 rabbits, if you do $1,000 on that farm, you would then have access to that savings account. And I believe that would be a fairer future and a better path for our rural communities. And we love Lamoni. Lamoni has really, think about it, for the farm. It's got a grain elevator, hardware store, CarQuest. All these businesses are right here in this town. The sale barn, it's a good place for the livestock and the crops to be. Thank you. Yeah. Hey, yeah. Oh, okay. Could I give you guys one observation from DC? Is that okay? Oh, short one. Okay, so when I wrote this book, you don't know where it's going to take you, and it didn't take me very far, but it did get me a free trip to DC. So that I had joined a group. A guy read this from a Western Wyoming rancher, read, and the Wyoming rancher ran this organization for competitive marketing. So he invites me to go to DC with him, and he wants me to be on the board after he read this book. So, so the book did do a little something that way. And so this is when Trump says, we're going to bring in Argentina cattle. And so we went there to DC and said, hey, Trump, you're going to bring in these Argentine cattle, give us MPOOL, mandatory country of origin labor. And so that was my message in front of all these congressmen. So we get finally to Randy Feenstro's office. And Randy Feenstro's, yeah, and I'm thinking, friendly territory. Republican, big livestock area. And they just flat shut the door on mandatory country boards and labels. I'm like, how could this be? Do you guys think you could find a rancher or farmer anywhere in the U.S. that doesn't want his beef labeled product of the USA? I bet you couldn't find a single one. We carry these on the back of our livestock trailers, that we want mandatory country boards and labeling back on our beef. Obama killed it when he had Bill Sack in office back in 2014. So they actually took mandatory country boards and labeling away from the farmers and ranchers. So, we thought, at least if you're going to bring in foreign beef, let us label, make it be labeled. Well, the Republicans don't like it. So I'm sitting there on a deck with a younger congressman aide of lobbyists. And I said, it's a problem with us going to DC is that, we make our point as voters, but the next guy in is carrying an envelope of money. We don't have any money with our group. So the next guy comes in with this money, and all of a sudden, we didn't communicate as much as that money did. And the kid said to me, don't you know about Citizens United? I said, no, I have never heard. I think I might have heard of it, but it was a 5-4 Supreme Court ruling that said money is speech. And it was all to combat the Hillary Clinton film. So the Republicans were going along with this so that they could put money into this film, apparently, and it created PACs and super PACs. So the attitude of all those DC apparatchiks, the swamp creatures, is that money is more powerful than your vote. And it's a terrible thing. It started in 2010, and I really think that's when Congress went to books. And we really need to fight this somehow. But that's probably the most impressive thing I learned out of DC. So Feenstra did not want to represent the mandatory country of origin labeling at all. Our very own representatives don't represent the farm. And here, a little step farther, the NCBA takes all of our checkoff money. All of us farmers, $2,000 a week are sent out from the sale barn in town to the checkoff. And they get it from us, and then they hand it to the NCBA. So the NCBA is a big cattlemen's group that goes to DC, and the packers are in their ear, and the packers are saying, we want that foreign beef, and we don't want to have to label it because it cheapens up the hamburger. So that's what's going on here. Here's a farmer saying, I reluctantly give my checkoff dollar to the sale barn. The sale barn gives it to the NCBA. The NCBA goes to DC and changes what our original intent was. But because money is speech, the NCBA, and by the way, the Farm Bureau has that same policy. The Farm Bureau is against mandatory country boards and labels. So two of our biggest voices that go to DC are against us, the cattle. It's a terrible thing. But that's what I learned on the last trip to DC.